Reed Monroe stood in his kitchen, methodically chopping vegetables for the anniversary dinner he planned. The sharp blade of the chef's knife sliced through crisp bell peppers and onions with practiced ease. He glanced at his watch. 5:30 p.m. Carmen should be home soon. As if on cue, he heard the front door open and close, and Harmon appeared in the doorway, still dressed in her work attire, a sleek pencil skirt and silk blouse. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but a few strands had escaped, framing her face. "Hey," she said, her voice tight. "What's all this?" Reed sat down and turned away from the knife. To face her, he replied simply, "Dinner." "For our anniversary," Carmen said. Her eyes widened slightly. "Of course," she replied, glancing around the kitchen. She took in the bottle of wine chilling in an ice bucket, the unlit candles on the table, and the soft music playing in the background. Reed watched her carefully, noting the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, how her fingers played with the strap of her purse. "Everything okay?" he asked. Carmen plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but she was just a bit stressed. "Work's been crazy," she said, hesitating for a moment. Then she added, "Actually, about that, I hate to do this, but I need to go back to the office. We've got this last-minute project, and the client's breathing down our necks." Reed felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of disappointment and suspicion. He'd grown accustomed to it over the past few months. He kept his face neutral and his voice calm. On our anniversary, Carmen had the grace to look guilty. "I know, I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. I promise it's just how it is. This could mean a big promotion for me." Reed nodded slowly. "Right." He turned back to the cutting board, picking up the knife again. "Don't worry about it. Go do what you need to do." He could feel Carmen hesitate behind him. "Are you sure you're not mad?" Reed looked over his shoulder, his expression carefully blank. "It's fine, Carmen. I get it. Work comes first." Carmen stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Hey, that's not fair. I know how important this is to me and to us. A promotion would mean I said it's fine." Reed interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to soften his voice. "You know, we can celebrate another time." Carmen leaned in and kissed his cheek. "You're the best. I'll try not to be too late with that." She was gone, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She left. Reed stood still for a while after he heard the front door close. Then, in a slow, deliberate way, he started to clean up. He poured the chopped vegetables into a container and put it in the fridge. He put the wine back in the liquor cabinet. He blew out the candles he'd lit earlier, watching the thin smoke disappear into the air as he worked. Reed's mind was racing. This wasn't the first time Carmen had canceled plans at the last minute. She'd been working late more often, and he'd noticed her phone conversations had become shorter and more abrupt. He tried to ignore the signs and give her the benefit of the doubt, but the persistent feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. Reed glanced at the clock. 6. It's 5:15 p.m. 6:15 p.m. He made up his mind and went out to his car. The streets of Chicago were busy with evening traffic as Reed drove towards the financial district where Carmen worked. He parked a block away from our office building and waited. He kept his eyes fixed on the entrance, and minutes turned into an hour. Reed's fingers drummed restlessly on the steering wheel, and just as he was about to go home, he saw her. Carmen emerged from the building with a man with sandy blonde hair. Reed recognized him immediately as Shane, the graphic designer from Carmen's office. He'd met Shane at a company party once, and he'd noticed the way his eyes had lingered on Carmen. Back then, Reed had brushed it off as harmless flirtation. Reed went home, where he saw her. Carmen came out of the building, but she wasn't alone. A tall man with sandy blonde hair walked beside her, his hand on her back. Reed recognized him immediately as Shane, the graphic designer from Carmen's office. He'd met Shane at a company party once, and noticed the way his eyes lingered on Carmen a bit too long. Reed had brushed it off as harmless flirtation at the time. Reed watched them walk to Shane's car, their bodies angled towards each other, laughing at some shared joke. He followed them at a discreet distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. They didn't head towards Carmen's office or any of the nearby restaurants. Instead, Shane's car wound its way through the city until it pulled up outside a familiar bar. Outside a bar called the Rusty Nail, which Shane liked to hang out at. He could see it across the street. His mind was racing. He could confront them now. He could storm over to the bar and demand answers. But something held him back. A cold, calculating part of him whispered to wait. Wait to gather more evidence. Make absolutely sure before he acted. So he waited. He watched the entrance of the bar through the large front window. He could see Carmen and Shane. Seated at a corner table, they were leaning in close, their hands intertwined on the table. Reed watched as Shane reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind Carmen's ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. The sight sent a jolt of pain through Reed's chest, quickly followed by a wave of icy rage. He gripped his steering wheel tighter and forced himself to stay put to keep watching. The hours passed, and the bar began to empty as the night wore on. Finally, just after midnight, Carmen and Shane emerged. They were a little unsteady on their feet, leaning into each other as they walked to Shane's car. Reed's jaw clenched as he watched Shane open the passenger door for Carmen, his hand lingering on her waist as she got in. Reed followed them again, this time to an apartment complex he didn't recognize. He parked. Across the street, Reed watched as Shane and Carmen stumbled out of the car and made their way inside the building. For a long moment, he sat in silence, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Then, with deliberate movements, he got out of his car and walked across the street. He found Shane's name on the buzzer panel and noted the apartment number. Back in his car, Reed waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he knew he couldn't leave just yet, not until he had proof of what he already knew to be true. As the hours passed, his anger cooled, turning from a hot, reactive fury into something more calculated. He thought about the years he'd spent with Carmen, the life they'd built together. He thought about trust and betrayal, about loyalty and deceit. Gradually, a plan began to form in his mind. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Reed noticed movement in one of the apartment windows. He saw Carmen and Shane wrapped in each other's arms, kissing passionately. The sight should have hurt. It should have torn him apart. Instead, Reed felt oddly calm, almost detached, with steady hands. He turned on his car's headlights, aiming them directly at Shane's. The bright beams cut through the early morning darkness, illuminating the scene inside like a spotlight. Reed watched as Carmen and Shane broke apart, startled by the sudden light. He saw the moment of confusion on their faces, followed quickly by panic as they rushed to the window. Finally, he saw the horror in Carmen's eyes as she recognized his car. Reed held her gaze, but he didn't say anything. Reed didn't yell or gesticulate wildly. He simply stared, his face a mask of cold fury. Then, without a word, he put his car in gear and drove away, leaving Carmen and Shane frozen in the window, bathed in the harsh glare of his headlights. Reed drove aimlessly for a while, his mind oddly quiet. The city was just beginning to wake up around him, with early morning joggers and dog walkers populating the sidewalks. Eventually, he found himself pulling up outside a familiar bar, the Grindstone, which was owned by his best friend Zane. The closed sign was still hanging in the window, but Reed knew Zane would be inside getting ready for the day. He knocked on the door 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet street. A moment later, Zane appeared, his expression changing from annoyance to concern as he recognized Reed. He quickly unlocked the door. "Reed, what are you doing here so early?" Reed stepped inside looking like hell. The familiar smell of stale beer wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. He needed a drink. Zane raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He locked the door behind Reed and moved behind the bar, pulling out a bottle of top-shelf whiskey and 2 glasses. "All right, talk to me, what's going on?" Reed settled onto a bar stool, accepting the glass. Zane slid a glass towards him. He took a long sip, letting the burn of the alcohol ground him. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, he began to speak. He told Zane everything that had happened at the cancelled anniversary dinner. He also told him about his suspicions regarding Carmen and Shane, the long night of waiting, and finally, the damning scene in the apartment window. Zane listened silently, refilling their glasses when needed. His face grew darker with each new detail. When Reed finished, Zay let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Reed, I'm so sorry, what are you going to do?" Reed's smirk was dangerous as he clinked his glass against Zay's. He was paying back, and he was already thinking of revenge as they drank. The first rays of sunlight were filtering through the bar windows, marking the start of a new day. But for Reed, it marked the beginning of something else. It was the start of something else, a calculated, unforgiving campaign of retribution against those who had betrayed him. The joke was over. And now it was time for Carmen and Shane to face the consequences of their actions. Reed woke early the next morning, his mind clear despite the lack of sleep he'd spent the night on. Zay's couch was no longer an option for the first few hours of the day, as the sun was starting to rise and he needed to get a move on. He found Zane in the kitchen brewing coffee. His friend looked up as Reed entered, concern etched on his face. "How are you holding up, man?" Reed took the mug Zane offered him and took a long sip before answering, "I'm fine. I know what I need to do." Zay leaned against the counter and looked at Reed's face. "You sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no going back." Reed finished. "I know, but she made her choice. Now it's time for me to make mine." Reed nodded slowly. "Right, what's the plan?" He sat down with his mug, his eyes cold and determined. "First, I need to go home. There are some things I need to take care of." The drive back to his house felt surreal. Reed parked in the driveway, noting Carmen's car was already there. He took a deep breath and steeled himself. As he entered, he heard movement upstairs. Carmen appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes red and puffy. "Reed, where have you been? I've been calling you all night." Reed ignored her and moved purposefully into the dining room. He pulled out a thick envelope from his briefcase, and Carmen followed him, her voice trembling. "Reed, please, we need to talk about this. It's not what you think, is it?" "Did I misunderstand?" Carmen flinched at his words. "I made a mistake. It was stupid. I know that. But it didn't mean anything. Shane and we just saved it." Reed cut her off. He gestured to the envelope on the table. "Divorce papers. I had them drawn up months ago." Carmen's eyes widened in shock. "But why?" Reed laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "I'm not an idiot, Carmen. I saw the way you were at work, the late nights, the phone calls, the way you'd pull away whenever I tried to get close. I knew something was wrong, but I just didn't want to believe it." Tears welled up in Carmen's eyes. "Reed, please, we can work this out. I'll end it with Shane." "Things with Shane. I promise it was just a fling." "It didn't mean anything. A fling," Reed said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that what you call betraying your marriage vows? Breaking the trust of the person who stood by you for 10 years? Carmen reached out, trying to grasp his hand. Reed stepped back, avoiding her touch. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. Please give me another chance. I love you, Reed." For a moment, Reed said nothing. Then, his voice cold and controlled, he spoke. "You made your choice, Carmen. Now, you have to live with it." He turned away from her, picking up a notepad from the counter as he wrote. He continued speaking. "I've already started the paperwork to sell the house." Carmen gasped. "What? You can't do that without my consent." Reed looked up from his paperwork. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I remember that refinancing we did last year. You were too busy to deal with it, so you gave me power of attorney." There was a note attached to the divorce papers from Shane, offering her freedom. Carmen's face crumpled. "Please don't do this, Reed. We can work it out. We can go to counseling." "There's nothing to work out," Reed interrupted. "You made your bed, Carmen. Now lie in it with it." With that, he turned and walked out of the house, ignoring Carmen's sobs behind him as he got into his car. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The first phase of his plan was complete. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Reed moved into a small apartment, working hard during the day and planning his revenge at night. He ignored Carmen's calls and messages, which got more desperate with each one. A week after their confrontation, he received a call from an unknown number. He answered wearily. "Hello? This is Lila Eastwood from HR at Pinnacle Marketing. I hope you don't mind me calling, but there's been some talk around the office and I thought you should know." Reed's interested. "What kind of talk, Miss Eastwood?" "Your wife and ex." Reed was interested to hear that the conversation around the office was about his wife and Shane Reeker. He wanted to know if there was more to it than that. He appreciated that she was telling him this, but he was curious as to why. There was a pause. "Let's just say that he had no respect for people who don't keep their promises," Leah finally replied. Her voice was firm. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Reed smiled to himself. "Actually, Miss Eastwood, there might be. Can we meet for coffee the next day?" "Hello, Mr. Monroe," she said, sliding into the seat opposite him. "Thank you for meeting me." Please call me Reed. Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your discretion in this matter. Layla nodded. Her eyes were sharp. Now what can I do to help? Reed leaned forward, his voice low. I need information. Layla, if you could tell me anything you know about Carmen and Shane's relationship, how long it's been going on, who knows about it, and how it's affecting their work, I'd appreciate it. Layla didn't hesitate. It's been going on for at least 6 months as far as I can tell. They thought they were being discreet, but she snorted. Let's just say subtlety isn't their strong suit. As for who knows, at this point pretty much everyone. The gossip spread like wildfire after you confronted them. Reed nodded, taking in the information and their work. Layla said bluntly that she's distracted, making mistakes, and Shane, well, let's just say his charm isn't working as well as it used to. People are starting to see him for what he really is. Reed asked, genuinely curious, Are you starting to see him for what he really is? Layla's eyes hardened. He's a selfish, manipulative jerk who doesn't care who he hurts as long as he gets what he wants. Reed couldn't help but smile. Thank you, Layla. You've been an unexpected ally. Is there anything else you think I should know, Layla? She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. This contains some sensitive information, emails, calendar entries, that sort of thing. I probably shouldn't have access to this. But she shrugged. Sometimes people forget to log out of their computers. Reed took the drive and slipped it into his pocket. I appreciate this, Layla, he said, more than you know. As they parted ways, Reed felt a surge of satisfaction. The pieces of his plan were falling into place. Over the next few weeks, he put the information Lila had given him to good use. He sent anonymous tips to Carmen's superiors about her work performance was going downhill. He'd heard some of the rumors about her and Shane. He kept an eye on things as Carmen's professional image started to fall apart. She was no longer as confident as she once was. She was getting looks and judgmental glances wherever she went. One evening, as Reed was leaving his office, his phone buzzed with a text from Zane. You need to see this. Come to the bar. Intrigued, Reed made his way to the bar. As he entered, Zane motioned him over to the end of the bar, where a small TV was mounted on the wall. There was a TV mounted on the wall. Zane said, Watch this. He turned up the volume on the screen. A news anchor was reporting that Shane Recker had been forced to resign from Pinnacle Marketing. The news source was close to the company. Recker's inappropriate behavior at work was the reason for his departure. This came after several complaints had been filed. Reed couldn't help but smile at the news, even though he knew the company's HR department would be none too pleased. Zane noticed and raised an eyebrow. You're doing it, he said. Reed just shrugged, his face a mask of innocence. I made my bed, he said. Now, don't get on my bad side. As they shared a drink, Reed's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Carmen. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. What do you want? Her voice came through shaky and desperate. Reed, please. I need to talk to you. Can we meet? He ended the call without waiting for a reply. Zane looked at him, wondering what was going on. You sure about this? He asked. Reed nodded, his eyes cold. It's time to end this, he said. An hour later, Reed heard a knock at his apartment door. He opened it to find Carmen standing there. She looked like a shadow of her former self, her eyes red-rimmed, and her usually immaculate appearance a little disheveled. Reed's appearance was disheveled. Come in, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Carmen stepped inside, her eyes darting around the sparse apartment. I don't know where to start, she said. How about the truth? Reed suggested, his tone neutral. I see. Carmen flinched at his words. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I've lost everything, my job, my reputation. Shane Reed raised an eyebrow. Shane, what happened? Carmen laughed bitterly. He dumped me. He said I was too much drama. Can you believe it? I threw everything away for him. She trailed off, tears welling up in her eyes. What do you want from me? Her voice was firm, and she looked up at him, her eyes pleading for a second chance. Please, I love you. I know I don't deserve it, but I always have. What I did with Shane was stupid and selfish, but it didn't mean anything. You're the one I want to be with for a long time. Reed said nothing. He studied Carmen's face, seeing. He saw desperation, fear, and hope, but then slowly shook his head and said no. Carmen's face crumpled as she pleaded, "Please, no." He repeated firmly, "You're right, Carmen. You don't deserve a second chance. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. You chose to betray me, lie to me, and throw away 10 years. A marriage for what? A fling with a colleague?" He stepped closer to her, his eyes boring into hers. "You made your choice, Carmen. Now you have to live with the consequences. I don't love you anymore. I don't even know if I ever really knew you. Promise me just one more chance, Reed. Step back, Carmen, and give it a rest. It's too late for that. We're done. The divorce will be finalized soon, and then you'll be out of my life for good." "What am I supposed to do?" Carmen cried, her voice breaking. "I've lost everything." Reed's face was impassive as he opened the door. "The door that's not my problem anymore. Goodbye, Carmen," as he closed the door on her sobbing form. As he looked out over the city, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he watched the light fade, Reed felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The anger, the pain, the betrayal were still there, but muted. Now, they were overshadowed by a sense of grim satisfaction. He had survived more than that. Reed had emerged victorious. Carmen and Shane had thought they could play him for a fool, but they'd been wrong. They'd underestimated him, and that was their downfall as darkness fell over the city. Reed turned away from the window. He had a new life to build now, one free from the shadows of betrayal and deceit. Looking towards that future, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The sun had barely risen when Reed's phone buzzed with a text. "You need to see this, Shane's apartment." He frowned, quickly dressing and heading out. Reed arrived at Shane's building just as Lila pulled up in her car. "What's going on?" he asked as they walked towards the entrance. "Layla's excited and vindicated," she replied. "Carmen showed up about an hour ago. They've been arguing ever since." Reed raised an eyebrow. "How do you know this?" "I may have made friends with Shane's neighbor," Leah replied with a smile. "She's been keeping me updated." They reached Shane's floor and found an older woman standing in the hallway, her ear pressed against Shane's door. She looked up as they approached, nodding in recognition at Lila. "You're just in time," the woman said. Reed stepped closer to the door. Carmen's voice was getting clearer. "How could you do this to me, Shane?" Carmen's voice was shrill, tinged with desperation. "After everything I gave up for you, Shane." Carmen's response was cold and dismissive. "Come on, Carmen, you can't be serious. What did you expect?" "I left my husband for you," Carmen shouted. "I lost my job, my reputation, everything, and that's my problem." Shane's voice dripped with disdain. "Look, it was fun while it lasted. But let's be real, you're too much drama. I don't need this in my life." There was a moment of stunned silence. Silence, then the sound of something shattering against a wall. "You bastard," Carmen screamed. "You ruined my life." "No, sweetheart," Shane replied. "You did that all on your own. I didn't force you to cheat on your husband. I didn't make you risk your job. That was all you." The door suddenly flew open, and Shane stormed out, nearly colliding with Reed. He stumbled back, his eyes widening in shock. "What the hell are you doing here?" Reed demanded before Carmen could respond. She appeared in the doorway, her face tear-stained and her hair a mess. She froze when she saw Reed, her expression a mix of shame and, "Reed, I'm sorry, but I can explain." Reed held up a hand to silence her. He turned to Shane and said in a calm but firm voice, "You and I need to have a chat." Shane's bravado faltered under Reed's cold stare. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. You should have thought of that before you slept with my wife." Reed cut him off. Reed glanced at Lila. "Could you give us a moment?" Lila nodded, ushering the neighbor back to her apartment. Reed turned back to Shane and Carmen. "Both of you, inside now." They filed back into Shane's apartment. The tension was palpable. Reed closed the door behind them, surveying the scene. A shattered vase lay on the floor. Reed pointed to the scattered water and flowers on the floor. "Listen carefully," he said. He turned to Carmen first. "You made a choice. You chose to throw away our marriage and betray my trust. You chose to destroy the life we built together. You chose to throw away our marriage, betray my trust, and destroy the life we built together. For what?" He jerked his head toward Shane, who flinched. Carmen opened her mouth to speak, but Reed silenced her with a look. "I'm not finished. You want to know the worst part? It's not that you cheated, it's that you You lied for months, looking me in the eye and lying every time we spoke on the phone, every time you pulled away from me. All lies. Shane, you think you're clever, don't you? You're the office charmer, the guy who can get any woman he wants. Did it make you feel big sneaking around with her? A married woman did it. Did it make you feel better knowing you were destroying someone else's relationship? Shane's face flushed with anger. Hey, I didn't force her to do anything. She came to me. Shut up, Reed snapped. You're both adults. You both made your choices, and now you're both going to face the consequences. He pulled out his phone. His phone showed them the screen. I have emails, text messages, photos, everything. Your little affair wasn't as secret as you thought. I could ruin both of you with this. I could destroy what's left of your careers and your reputations. Carmen gasped. Her face paled. Reed, please. You wouldn't. You wouldn't. I didn't think I'd find out about your affair either, did you? You both severely underestimated me. He pocketed his phone, his eyes hard. But I'm not going to do that. Not because you don't deserve it, but because you're not worth the effort. You've already ruined your own lives. I don't need to do anything more. To leave. But Shane's voice stopped him. That's it, you're just going to walk away. Reed turned back slowly, his eyes boring into Shane's. What did you expect? That I'd punch you? That we'd have some dramatic showdown? He shook his head. You're not worth it. Shane, neither of you are. He looked at Carmen one last time. The divorce will be finalized next week. After that, I don't want to see or hear from either of you again. Is that clear? Carmen nodded, tears streaming down her face. Shane just looked away, his jaw clenched. Reed opened the door, pausing for a moment. You know, I almost feel sorry for you both, he said, almost with that, and walked out. Reed closed the door firmly behind him and found Lila waiting in the hallway. She looked at him with wide eyes, full of curiosity. What happened? He asked. It's over, he replied. Let's get out of here. As they walked out of the building, Lila studied Reed's face. Are you okay? She asked. I'm fine, he replied. You know what I mean. I feel free for the first time in a long time. Layla nodded, admiration in her eyes. You're stronger than I would have been. I don't know if I could have faced them like that. Reed shrugged. They don't have any power over me anymore. I've taken that away from them. They parted ways. Reed felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had faced his betrayers, looked them in the eye, and walked away on his own terms. It was a victory, but a bit sweet. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had faced his betrayers, looked them in the eye, and walked away on his own terms. It was a victory, but a bit sweet. The next few days passed in a blur. Reed threw himself into his work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects. It was easier to focus on coding than to dwell on the ruins of his personal life. On Friday evening, Reed was packing up to leave when his boss stopped by his desk. Reed got a minute, so he followed him to his office. His boss closed the door and looked serious. I'm not going to beat around the bush, he said. We've been impressed with your work. I've been really impressed lately. I know you've been going through a rough patch, but your performance has been outstanding. Reed straightened in his chair. Thank you, sir. I've been trying to stay focused. His boss nodded. That's why I wanted to talk to you. We've got a new project starting up. It's a big one, Fortune 500. Client, cutting-edge tech, we need our best people on it, and we want you to lead the development team. Reed blinked in surprise. Lead the team? Are you sure? Absolutely, his boss replied with a smile. It comes with a significant pay bump and a promotion to senior developer. What do you say? A slow smile spread across Reed's face. I'll start as soon as I can, I said to myself as I left the office that evening. My step was lighter than it had been in months. I pulled out my phone and dialed Zane's number. Hey man, you free tonight? I've got news and we're celebrating a few hours later. I was reading at the bar in the Grindstone, nursing a whiskey as I filled Zane in on the events of the past few days. Reed whistled low. Damn, you've been busy, conquering a big promotion and confronting Carmen. Landing a promotion is one thing, but landing one while also dealing with Carmen is another. It's been a hell of a week, Zane said, studying his friend's face. Are you really doing it, though? I feel like I'm in control of my life and moving forward, not just treading water. Zane nodded and clapped Reed on the shoulder. I'm proud of you, man. You've been through a lot, but you came out stronger. As they continued to talk and drink, Reed felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had survived the storm and emerged from the wreckage of his marriage wasn't just intact, it was stronger than ever. He'd faced his betrayers and walked away on his own terms. The next week passed quickly, and he threw himself into preparations for his new role at work. He barely noticed when the final divorce papers arrived. He signed them without hesitation, feeling a sense of closure as he dropped them in the mailbox on Saturday. One morning, Reed found himself driving through his old neighborhood. He hadn't planned to come here, but something had drawn him back. As he turned onto his old street, he saw a moving truck parked in front of his former home. He pulled over and watched as a young family bustled about, carrying boxes and furniture into the house. A little girl chased a dog. Across the lawn, her laughter carried on the breeze. It was a scene of domestic bliss, similar to what he had once imagined for himself and Carmen. As he sat there lost in thought, he noticed a familiar figure on the sidewalk. Carmen stood frozen, staring at the scene before her. She looked haggard, a far cry from the polished professional she had once been. He'd been tempted to drive away, but something made him get out of the car instead. He approached Carmen slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Carmen," he said softly. She startled, turning to face him, her eyes widening in recognition. A mix of emotions flashed across her face: shame, regret, longing. "Reed," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" He just drove by, shrugging. Carmen's eyes went back to the house. He didn't know why, he just felt like he needed to see it one last time. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the happy family in their old home. Finally, Carmen spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Reed. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm truly deeply sorry." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. He saw how their divorce had affected her, the dark circles under her eyes, the slump in her shoulders, the defeat in her posture. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of pity, but then he remembered the lies and betrayal and pain she had caused. The pity faded, replaced by a cool detachment. "Detachment, you're right," he said calmly. "It doesn't change anything." Carmen flinched at his words but nodded. "I know. I just wanted you to know I've lost everything. Reed, my job, my reputation, my life, and it's all my fault. What do you want from me? Forgiveness, absolution. I can't give you that." Tears welled up in Carmen's eyes. "I don't know. What I want is for us to get back together. I miss you and what we had. You destroyed it, and now we both have to live with that." He turned back to the house, watching as the little girl ran into her father's arms, squealing with delight as he swung her around. "Look at them," he said softly. "That could have been us, a family of the future. You threw it all away for a fling with a colleague who didn't even care about you." Carmen was sobbing quietly next to him. "I know, Reed, I know. I've thought about every moment and every decision over and over. If I could go back, I would. But you can't," Reed interrupted. "We can't go back. We have to move forward." He turned to face her. "I'm not angry anymore. Carmen, I'm not even hurt. I'm just done with this chapter of our lives. It's over. It's time for both of us to move on." Carmen wiped her eyes and nodded, slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. I just don't know how to let go." Reed's expression softened slightly. "You'll figure it out, we both will. But not together, never again together. Bye, Carmen. I hope you find what you're looking for, but I won't be the one to give it to you." As he walked back to his car, Reed heard Carmen call out one last time, "Reed, are you happy?" and drove away, leaving Carmen and the remnants of their shared past behind as he merged onto the highway, heading back to his new apartment and new life. Reed felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. He had weathered the storm. The storm of betrayal emerged stronger and more resilient. The joke was over, and he had the last laugh as the city skyline came into view. Reed allowed himself a small smile. The future was his to shape now, unburdened by the weight of broken promises and shattered trust. As he drove towards that future, Reed Monroe felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope.